I want to talk today about illusions and perceptions and how we're taught to see things in a certain way. These are optical illusions, and I kind of related it to how we're taught to see things and how we're taught to see things that aren't really the way they are. So, this is just a bunch of dots on green background with the white areas alternating. So it appears as though this these dots are moving in a wave-like pattern when we know for a fact they're really not, because this is not a video, this is just a screenshot. So based on these sort of highlights around these dots, it appears as though this is doing something that's not actually doing. There's also some optical illusions where you think that this ball is yellow, but when you look away, it's green. And this ball is blue, but when you look away, it's pink. And so it's changing. It's constantly changing depending on where you look on the picture. And then there's some illusions where you stare at it for a certain period of time and then you look away and you can see that same picture on a blank wall and it's not really there. Or you look at something and then you look away and it's moving, but it's not really moving. And this is in my effort to explain to you the states and the Constitution. So we have two different states in the Constitution. We have the states that created the federal government, and we have the states that the federal government created. So the states that created the federal government were the states created by settlers and inhabitants of the entire territory of that place. So for example, I use Texas because I'm most familiar with it. Texas, just the word Texas, represents an entire land territory. It was settled by settlers and inhabitants. Settlers are called settlers because they settle the land. They take it from being wild and untamed to cultivating it and growing crops on it and using the wood on it to make things and build houses, and so they settle it. Inhabitants come to the land and they live on the land. They may not own property, but they inhabit the land. Once the land is settled, it can be inhabited. So the inhabitants and settlers create a government for themselves. This is the free, sovereign, and independent state. Now, this state, along with the other states, when they joined the Union, they gave some of their land, some very small portions of their land, and in Texas, very, very small portions of land, considering the entire mass of Texas, to the federal government, to which the federal government was allowed to create a state. So a state inside a state, a federal state inside of a free state. This federal state is called State of Texas. And when Texas joined the Union, the contract states that it was going to erect into it, not it into, erect those lands given to it, to the federal government. Those lands annexed to the federal government, those lands were going to be erected into a new state. They didn't erect Texas into a new state. They couldn't because the state belonged to the settlers and inhabitants. That's the way you make a state, through populations. So the free, sovereign, and independent state created the federal government and allowed the federal government to create a state inside of it for defense purposes. Forts, a military power. Because in order to become a nation, there has to be fortifications. That's in the laws of nation. Now, the law of nation is not a real law, so to as what we think of as being a law, but more like a guide on how to build a nation. Among those things would be like education, roads, trade, all sorts of things, but defense is just one of those things. So the Constitution that created these states was created for defense purposes, and that's what they had the power to do, to allow for the creation of a state inside of a state for defense purposes. Now, what you create, you control. That's an ancient maxim that goes back for thousands of years. Something that has lasted that long is considered an absolute truth. That which you create, you control. And to further explain this, we say things like the master cannot be also the servant. You have a servant and you have a master. So the master would be the settlers and inhabitant who created the state. That's the ultimate master of the nation. The people who create the federal government, the people who create the state. They are the masters and the federal government is the servant. And then the federal government was restricted to federal lands. So the federal lands are controlled by the federal government, and the federal government is controlled by the free states, and the free states are controlled by the settlers and inhabitants. And that's the way jurisdiction and sovereignty works in this country, the United States of America. So you have the settlers and inhabitants are first. They command their creation, which is the free, sovereign, and independent state. The free, sovereign, and independent state created the federal government for defense purposes, and it commands that federal government. So we are supposed to command, through our state, the federal government. The federal government then created smaller states inside our states, I call them dependent states or military states or federal states, and they command those states. And that's in all the laws, all the contracts, it's in the Constitution. So when you look at the Constitution, you have to decipher between whether the state is commanding the federal government or whether the federal government is commanding the state. And then you can see the difference between the two states. Now, there's nothing in the Constitution that allows the federal government to command the free states. The federal government only can command what it created. The dependent states, the small states, the federal lands inside the free, sovereign, and independent states. So when it says this state cannot this and that state cannot that, it's talking about its own creation because that is all that it can control. That is all that it can command because the sovereign commands its servant. The states, the big states controlled by the settlers and inhabitants, are only, I think, referred to in here as particular states, and maybe in a few other places like the inhabitants of the state. So when it talks about the qualifications for Congress, it says cannot also be an inhabitant of the state. And that has to do with becoming a citizen and moving on to the federal lands and becoming a federal citizen. And I talk about that in other videos. So when they say the state of Texas cannot secede from the Union, that is absolutely true. The state of Texas is a creation of the federal government. The federal government states cannot become independent states because that would create an independent state inside of an independent state. That cannot happen. The independent state, the state created by us free people, the settlers and inhabitants of Texas, can secede from the Union. And we do that by taking control of the federal lands, the state of Texas inside Texas. That federal state, all we do is we take it back. But we can't go through the Congress of the state of Texas because that is a different state. That's the federal state. That is not our federal government. If you look up the history of the capital of Texas in Austin, the building when it was being built, it was built after the Civil War, after annexation. I'm sorry, it was built after annexation. And after it was built, after annexation, they had already erected state of Texas, yet on the rotunda floor in the Capitol building it says Republic of Texas. That's because at that time people understood there was one state for the state of Texas, which was the federal government, and one state for the people, which was Texas. Now the people of Texas, the settlers and inhabitants, that Capitol building belongs to them. But after the Civil War, that all changed, and there was a coup, and it was taken over for purposes of pretend purposes of slavery, but we know it was more than that. Freedom of the slaves was simply a result, intended or unintended. Pulling the wool over your eyes, I guess you could say. So we wouldn't go to the state of Texas to annex itself because it cannot secede itself. So we can't take those lands back through the legislatures of the state of Texas. We have to form our own legislation and secede that way. Some people say we need a new constitution. Some people say we need a new Declaration of Independence. I agree, and I also disagree. Perhaps we just need to take the one that we already have and bring it forward. I think it was well written. I think it was a good document. They used the words properly, and I think it's good law. But we need to bring it forward. We need to bring it back to life. And we can do that pretty easily. But once we do that and we form our own legislatures, we can take back the federal lands from the federal government. But the state of Texas cannot become an independent state inside Texas. It cannot secede from the Union because it does not represent us. It represents the federal government. It belongs to the federal government, and it is a creation of the federal government. And those are shown inside of this Constitution. People claim there's 18 enumerated powers in the Constitution, and I disagree. I believe there are 3. Because the Constitution was created to create a military establishment, a military force for defense purposes. Right here, defense with a C, not defense with an S. There's a difference. Which is forts. Defense with a C is forts, fortifications. That's been done. At this point, it's only being used for tyrannical purposes. So the states inside the Constitution are the creation of the state of whatever state it is, like state of Texas. The only time they mention the free, sovereign, and independent state, just simply called states, they say particular states or an inhabitant of the state wherein he resides. So it's an illusion. It's sort of a, I don't know that it was an intentional trick, but it's been used to benefit the federal government, enlarging the federal government, which was created, in my opinion, for defense purposes. And the Constitution really has only three powers, which, in my opinion, are to declare war, make treaties for peace, and then declare peace. And everything in the Constitution is just how they're going to run the federal lands inside the free, sovereign, and independent states created by the League of Friendship between the states, called the Articles of Confederation. That means you have all your rights, not just the 10 listed in the Bill of Rights. That means that the Constitution is not really for us, it's for those who take an oath who are members, because it's for the United States of America. And we, the people of the United States, are the federal government, the people in the federal government in the states. I have more proof of this, and it'll be coming in another video. And it has to do with the flags and the stars and the laws, the way they're written. So that's it for this video. And I hope that you understand the states. That state is just a general term. What matters is who has sovereign power over it. Whoever has the sovereign power commands. The sovereign power lies in the hands of the settlers and inhabitants who create the state, who created the federal government, who created the smaller dependent states. Those smaller dependent states cannot secede from the Union. The settlers and inhabitants, the state they create, can. So there we have it. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, please leave them in the comment section, and I'll try my best to get back with you. And please like, share, and subscribe. I'll be making a lot more videos, and I'll see you in the next video. And if you can't like or share, or like and subscribe, then just share, because there are other people who would like to have this information. Okay, so you guys have a great day. Be safe out there, and be kind.